So encryption essentially is, in layman's terms, I would say it's a scrambling of the messages that we send to each other. Perhaps one of the highest forms of privacy that can be given to messaging. We now have 8th May as the deadline when end-to-end encryption will no longer be available on these direct messaging platforms. It will remain on WhatsApp. I think when messages are not encrypted in this day and age, we have to look at it in terms of real world examples where countries have moved more and more towards surveillance. I think what people need to acknowledge when they're communicating on Instagram or Messenger is this awareness, first of all, that their messaging is not encrypted. I think end to end encryption is now something in messaging that a lot of us started to take for granted, but it wasn't always the case.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another episode of Digipod on DawnNews English. I'm your host, Usama Khilji. Today, we're going to be talking about a very pertinent issue. We're hearing in the news that Instagram is ending its end to end encryption in its direct messages. What does that really mean for our privacy, for our safety? And we'll delve a little more into what the importance of encryption is, but what are the flip side arguments for against encryption as we hear from governments and law enforcement agencies around the world? To discuss this and a lot more, we're happy to be joined by Hassan Niazi, who's a lawyer who specializes in technology and is based in Lahore. Thank you very much for joining us, Hassan.
Thank you,
So,
Sama. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
so to start with, Hassan, maybe you can give us a bit of context on what end-to-end encryption really is in messaging, and why it has become such a central feature of modern messaging. And maybe you can tell us a bit about, the decision by Meta to discontinue encrypted messaging within its Instagram application.
Yes, of course, Osama. So I think end-to-end encryption is now something in messaging that a lot of us started to take for granted, but it wasn't always the case. So you have to go back a bit to when Edward Snowden's revelations came about in the US, right? And for those of you who might not be familiar, the revelations was there was a mass surveillance network being operated by the US government on its own citizens. And I think that was a big turning point for Americans, especially. I won't say for the rest of the world, but for Americans and American companies, it became a big turning point as people started to take their privacy very seriously. And actually, then I believe it was the US Director of National Intelligence who would even say that the Snowden revelations, what they did was they accelerated commercial encryption adoption by about 7 years after that happened. So, encryption essentially is, in layman's terms, I would say it's a scrambling of the messages that we send to each other. And because that message is scrambled, no one apart from the sender or receiver is able to actually look into that message or even if or intercept that message. And though that gives security, think of it as if you and I, Osama, are communicating, and for that communication, it's in a locked box and only you and I have the key. Now, once it's on your device, it's not encrypted anymore. And once it's on my device, it's not encrypted. But when it is being relayed between us, it is scrambled in a form that it cannot be intercepted. And that is why the core tension exists today between privacy, because encryption is perhaps one of the highest forms of privacy that can be given to messaging. And then on the other hand, there is the safety and law enforcement aspect of this entire debate. So after the Snowden revelations come, end-to-end encryption becomes something that is sought after. And the most secure protocol for this is known as the Signal Protocol. And WhatsApp adopts it fairly early. WhatsApp is one of the first movers here. But when it comes to Meta, right? So Meta acquires WhatsApp. WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted. But as things happen, as Cambridge Analytica happens, as Meta comes under more scrutiny for privacy, it starts to pivot, and Mark Zuckerberg says very clearly in a lot of open documents that we have and speeches that he delivers that privacy is going to be a core value of Meta. Especially after Cambridge, they had the Federal Trade Commission's order. So there was a lot of scrutiny. So what they decided to do was they would eventually get Instagram messaging and Facebook messaging to become end-to-end encrypted. Now, what we are talking about today, of course, is the falling apart of those plans, and we can get to that. But as sort of a overview, we now have 8th May as the deadline when end-to-end encryption will no longer be available on these direct messaging platforms. It will remain on WhatsApp.
Yes, and I think, what Meta is saying now is that because it owns so many of the communication applications that we used, you mentioned Instagram, you mentioned WhatsApp, you have Facebook. Facebook has its own messenger. So there's a family of applications that this company has, and it totals over 3 billion users worldwide, which is, close to almost half of the entire population of the world. So that's a lot of data that the company's processing on the daily. And what Meta has said is that, oh, we're ending encryption on Instagram, but people can still use WhatsApp for encrypted messaging, right? Um, but I would like to come back to Instagram and maybe talk about how initially when the app was bought, Instagram was just for sharing photographs, and then slowly messaging came into being, and now a lot of people communicate through it. So, what's the importance of encryption in messaging, especially when it comes to applications like Instagram? And what does it mean to take that back for users? So, you described what encryption and how it works very well. But in practical terms, what are the risks that people could face with their messages not being encrypted?
I think when messages are not encrypted in this day and age, we have to look at it in terms of real world examples where countries have moved more and more towards surveillance and mass surveillance systems. Now, we live in a world, unfortunately, where the justification for doing anything has become national security. And I believe, Osama, you also mentioned this recently on social media. And we are seeing this not just in Pakistan. It is not just a Pakistan specific issue, but all across the world. When I was working in Meta, I used to look at South and Central Asia, and I would see that it was a region-wide problem of mass surveillance networks by the government, technology being implemented by the government to surveil citizens, especially human rights defenders, journalists, political opponents. Now, what just one example of the risks that happen when messaging is not encrypted is because now a lot of these networks of human rights defenders and journalists utilize encrypted messaging to get their work done. Once that is taken away, you open them up to severe liability, especially from the state, right? And encryption itself, when you're a journalist, is an essential part of protecting your sources. So now your sources open up. You can't do your job. If you are a human rights defender and you are talking to a political dissident or a political opponent who might not be in favor with the government, that sort of communication opens up as well. But I think we understand a bit the risks from the government side. Remember, in encryption, even the company, the owners of the product, cannot see those messages. So even when you complain, let's say you complain on WhatsApp, which is the most secure one of the more secure ones, the company doesn't actually see your WhatsApp chat if you report a chat. It only sees more or less the last five messages in the chat because the application takes a screenshot and sends it for review. So even companies aren't able to see it. So that also gives us a level of security. Why? Because we need to be more conscious of the amount of information we are giving companies because we say a lot online, and we have seen through examples like Cambridge Analytica and so on how that is then used to direct influence operations. as well. So the data we have now in this world, which the European Union has even said that we have a right to be forgotten, all those rights become compromised if companies, the government, and a whole other network of bad actors even have access to your messaging through advanced technology that is pretty freely available now.
No, truly. And, it's an alarming nexus between companies and governments around the world where, companies who are supposed to be protecting the privacy of its users are not acting to do so anymore, as you described very well. And at the same time, government is hungry for more data, for more information on internet users, on its citizens. And this was illustrated very well in a case around maybe 10 years or so back in the case FBI versus Apple in the US, where FBI wanted backdoor access to messaging between two suspects in a shooting incident in California. But famously, Apple refused to offer that data. We've also seen, recently the contract between Anthropic and the Department of Defense in the US, in which Anthropic refused to go ahead with the contract because they did not want to, carry out a mass surveillance of citizens. So there has been some tension between companies and governments in the past. But what we're seeing now, as you describe, the national security paranoia that has been around, but is accelerating again now. So companies are more willing to give that up, that privacy and that security that it offers. But what I also want to come to is that when we end encryption, yes, companies can see it, and yes, that data can be provided to governments when governments ask companies for it. But it also opens up vulnerability to bad actors. And this could be, hostile governments that are not asking directly for information, but carrying out surveillance. And if it's unsecured messaging, they can have access to it. And it also gives us up to criminal activities, to scams, to people who want to steal data and perhaps also commit crimes, for child safety, especially. We hear from governments that encryption is a barrier to ensuring safety and exploitation of children. But if children are using Instagram and are messaging each other, bad actors who want to harm them can also view those messages. So in this context, Hassan, what do you think younger people or their parents or guardians should be doing, or everyday citizens, in order to protect themselves? So, for example, now with this change and with billions of people, especially young people, using Instagram, what should the next steps be?
I think, Osama, picking up a few things from what you said, I think there is another way of looking at it as well that we need to understand if we want to understand why this pushback against encryption is actually happening, because that helps us frame the argument a bit better when this comes. And you see, even within Meta, when the decisions were being taken that we should have end-to-end encryption, and there's a writer's report on this that goes into this very well, is that even within Meta, senior leadership was very resistant to having encryption in Instagram and Facebook. And the reasoning for that was that they felt that their safety tools or monitoring tools would not be able to work when it would come to protecting children. So, safety concerns. So, just like you said, harmful actors can come in when it's unencrypted. In encrypted communication, children can also be talking to people who are predators. And the companies and law enforcement started to believe that because of encryption, they could not get to these bad actors. So, for example, they could not access data. Law enforcement has had a big pain point for a long time that we cannot get access to WhatsApp data for bad actors, which might be child abuse, terrorism, or fraud and scams, right? These are the big ones that we're looking at. Now, because of all of that, we come to this tension between privacy and safety. Now, when you remove, however, encryption altogether, which is another extreme, and people have been relying on that communication for a long time, then we have everything that you described, which is the surveillance, which is more bad actors also, which is hacking, so on and so forth. I think what people need to acknowledge when they're communicating on Instagram or Messenger is this awareness, first of all, that their messaging is not encrypted, right? I think we, like I said, we have started to take for granted that messaging is somehow secure. You ask the common person that this question, and they will give you an answer that sort of indicates that messaging seems more secure. But once there is no encryption, it is no more secure than anything else. And if it's no more secure, then companies, bad actors, governments, all may have access to your data, whether or not they follow the proper due process mechanisms. So, first comes the awareness. Whereas the conversation around children and parents comes in, I think that what a lot of work needs to be done on creating awareness for parents about at the very least the existing safety tools that exist on these platforms, on these companies, but also how these platforms are used for by predators against children, right? So, for example, you do have safety settings on a system like Roblox, for example, where when you do messaging in game, you can turn off features that allow children to communicate with strangers, right? So there needs to be a lot more parental awareness that is done not just by the government, but by companies. And I really do believe that one of the solutions that we will have to come to as a society when it comes to children and parents and teen access to social media is the ability to have conversations with our children about what they are and are not doing on social media and what they are seeing. If we create a scenario, especially after all of this, where they feel that if someone has messaged them or they have seen something inappropriate and they cannot talk to anyone, that is going to be a much bigger problem. And some people, when I say this, see this as an unrealistic thing that there's no way children are going to, especially teens, are going to be talking to their parents about what they're doing on social media. But let me tell you something. Like one statistic that really blew my mind was that if you there are portals like Take It Down and Stop Non-Consensual Intimate Imagery. And for those of you who don't know, I would urge you to become familiar with these products. And what they do is they're not affiliated with any company. If, let's say, there's a picture or photo of of a minor, an intimate photo, they can upload it into that database and it will create what's known as a hash, which is a digital fingerprint. And it will disseminate that to the companies and they can then take that picture down. Why this is important is a lot of young men, young teens, were being made to believe that they were speaking to a woman. They were asked to send maybe an intimate picture, and then they would be blackmailed. And around 90% of some of the suicides that are happening because of this are by young men, because they do not know where to go to. They do not know whether to go to the police, their parents, who do they go to because they're so embarrassed and ashamed. And so we need to create more awareness of portals like this so that they know
Absolutely.
there is help available, because we cannot rely solely on government and companies anymore. We have seen the motivations, right? Governments are too motivated by cracking down on dissent, as we have seen in Pakistan. And companies essentially create too many friction points when it comes to safety. Most parents do not know enough. So I think we have to, whether it's civil society or human rights actors or child safety actors, we will unfortunately have to take on that role more and more.
No, absolutely. And I think, Hassan, you've described this very well. The need for, making parents and also children aware on what the risks are. And we're also seeing these days this move towards banning social media for children. It started with Australia, and a lot of countries, including Pakistan now, are moving towards, legislation that says children under the age of 16 should not be using social media. It's a whole separate debate, but of course it links to what we're discussing. At the end of the day, it's about safety. Um, but when we were talking about encryption and data, I also thought of metadata, and how even in encrypted applications like WhatsApp, companies and then in effect governments still have access to metadata of users. And of course, that's also used in law enforcement, investigations, etc. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit on what sort of metadata is available to companies, and including on applications like Instagram, on Facebook, and WhatsApp.
So I think WhatsApp is different because of its encryption, right? But Facebook and Instagram more generally, there is a large amount of data that companies do have access to. Usually, when we describe in the data disclosure context, so when law enforcement asks companies to disclose data, one of the most basic forms of that is known as BSI, which is basic subscriber information. And basic subscriber information is it would be your name, it could be, maybe your phone number if you that's what you've been using for getting access to the apps. It can also be your IP. So that sort of information can be shared with law enforcement, as long as the companies say that due process requirements are fulfilled. Now, being American companies, they are bound by American laws in terms of when and what they can share. So, to that extent, American law does provide some protections. But if, let's say, law enforcement in Pakistan, so the FIA used to have this power under PECA, now it's the NCCIA. Essentially, what happens is they go to a magistrate, they get an order that data be disclosed for a particular account because of XYZ offense under PECA. Now, if you look at those orders, and I'm sure, Osama, you have seen some of those orders, they are not very detailed, they're not very well reasoned. And so there's a question by itself about how much a due process is actually being followed there. But do they have access then to all sorts of data? Well, they might have access to BSI if a court order exists. In other countries, which have, for example, mutual legal assistance treaties, they might have access to even more information about you, your last known login and so on. When it comes to WhatsApp, the information that is available is generally the information that is unencrypted. Now, what is that? So, for example, your WhatsApp username, your profile picture, your status, if you put up a WhatsApp status, that is also unencrypted. And IP can also be made available. Now, if people are smart and savvy, they could use a VPN. For these things that are unencrypted, that data is available. And I would like to add also that now WhatsApp has channels. So WhatsApp channels are not encrypted. That is something that people need to be aware of. Uh, Chat between you and me is encrypted, but WhatsApp channels are generally unencrypted.
Absolutely. And, still we get a lot of questions from people that, are, I only spoke about something on WhatsApp, but, somehow there's a case against me, or the state
Yeah.
has found out. And despite the messaging being encrypted. So why is that? And despite encryption, what are ways that law enforcement or governments can access your chats?
So I think one of the things that is often kept under wraps by the government is as of right now, if you talk about the government of Pakistan, there's a number of technologies they do have access to that allows them to conduct pretty comprehensive surveillance. Um, and if you remember, a year or two ago, when we started really talking about the national firewall, which is essentially the web monitoring system that the PTA has had for a long time, which was being upgraded, as they say, more technology was introduced that essentially what it does is it also impacts things like WhatsApp. And how it impacts that is it slows down the platform. When it slows down the platform, what happens is images, videos, voice notes uh, cannot be easily accessed. So they would either you wouldn't be able to download it. If you can't download it, that means you can't really forward it. And that reduces the ability of things going viral. So we have to be aware of these sort of technologies. Now, the problem is that these technologies are not being acquired transparently, and there is no transparency by the government about them and what their capabilities are, how they are used, what legal authority do they have to use these things. Because surveillance in Pakistan can only be lawful under certain laws, like the Investigation of Fair Trial Act of 2013. But we live in a system where the legal and the extra legal um, live in some sort of different worlds. There has never been a warrant that we know of that has been obtained under the Investigation of Fair Trial Act. Yet we all know that surveillance is happening. So, why have we normalized the extra legal to such an extent? We have normalized audio recordings being leaked, which is unlawful surveillance, but we have normalized it. We have normalized it to the fact that we now, instead of taking privacy for granted, we take for granted that we are all probably under surveillance. And that is not a system, that is not a constitutional democracy system. So the state has the ability when people say, I spoke about it with someone on WhatsApp. Well, on their platform, when a message is sent to that other person and it is on their phone, then it is no longer encrypted. So if a phone is compromised and that technology does exist, then all your chats are compromised. If your phone is compromised, all your chats are compromised. Right? And I think that's the aspect that we need to be aware of. And then also, of course, we need to be aware of the fact that what we say often is being recorded by our phones, unless you specifically go way into your settings in Google and so on and try to turn it off. That's why when people say, I just spoke about something with a friend and suddenly I'm getting ads about it, there is a whole network that operates to be able to do that. It's not just what you say being recorded. They're looking at things like who is that data is then funneled by companies into the algorithm that serves you ads. Now, similar technology is now coming is Pegasus, which also exists, but there's a lot more technology that is now coming out.
Absolutely. And I think, what you described is the combination of metadata that enables governments to have all different information about you through WhatsApp other than messages, right? So that also includes what groups you're a part of, for
Yeah.
example, or what your story is on WhatsApp. And, like you mentioned, the IP address also gives out your location, what Wi-Fi connection you're connected to, or what data point where you're getting your internet data from. That's all available and not encrypted, and that's
Also,
why
I
I
would say
think
that your phone number is not encrypted, right?
exactly.
So, and a phone number is
So
linked to someone.
So it's an
Yeah.
identifier, right? Because especially now we have our SIMs and then our IMEI, our phones
Yes.
are also registered. with the government. So in effect, you're not really private or secure, and that's why so many people offer Signal, the messaging app, as a better encrypted
Yeah.
alternative to WhatsApp because it's open source, not for profit, and it has disappearing messages in the sense that when you read it, it can also disappear, so it doesn't stay on your device. So when we look at all of this, the debate around privacy and security really comes to fore. And I think, Hassan, you've described it really well. That, we need to be informed and know how this surveillance takes place, how the lack of encryption can then lead to different bad actors, governments, and companies accessing our messaging data, for example, on Instagram. And the cutoff date is in May. So after that, your messages are not encrypted anymore. So be careful what reels and memes you're sharing with your friends, because those are also open
Yeah.
to surveillance. But then also, we talked about how there needs to be responsibility on parents and children, on how they ensure their safety and safe usage of social media and the internet and different applications. But then also, you've described how companies make these decisions around encryption, and why governments want this access, right? And this tension of privacy and security then continues to exist. And in a national security heavy environment that we see around the world, security narratives are triumphing over safety, privacy, and encryption. So that's all from us today. Thank you very much for joining us, Hassan. And we'll be back with another episode of DigiPod on Dawn News English next week. This is your host, Osama Khilji, signing out.